A void encompassed Kallan. Distant voices faded in the dark. What pain there was she didn't feel. Not yet anyway, but she would. The darkness devours everything. Light does what it can to fight it off, producing endless energy to do so. Endless energy, endless save. Light has to try so hard. Darkness just is there, suspended in the grate, waiting for when the light goes out, when there can be nothing but the great void to welcome it. Such stories emerged from the black, some of them true, some seeded by a variant of truth. Most are just ludicrous lies. Every child grew up hearing the stories of the shadows, where figured brood with long, menacing fingers sharpened to fine tips, and pallid, sickly skins stretched over a skeletal flame. Their air was wild and wiry, and as black as their horrible eyes. Those dreadful, lifeless eyes, bulbous and bulging like polished black stones that could pierce through any darkness. It was those eyes that gave rise to the rumors of the shadows, for it was long said they could extract the light from anything, and with it, life. They drank blood and ate children. The sun was their only bane. Their breath brought the winter, their voices death. They never slept, and lived to devour. Over the years, rumors evolved, dramatizing their weaknesses. Pendants and charms wore to daunt them, herbs and spices woven and hung over thresholds, water stolen from Mimir's well, all to deter the shadows. All were just ludicrous lies. In truth, they were the Devagar, the Alpha race whose artisanship and forge drew them into the mountains long ago, before the ancient stories were ancient stories, before the forgotten war of the Aesir and the Vanir forced Odin to recoil into his halls in Asgard and accumulate the dead riders of this great hunt. For 3 ages the Devagar worked and honed and molded their jewels, melting metals and casting stones with a beauty that ages later none could surpass. Many once believed that the Devagar learned their art from the Vanir, but that was ages before the war and the schism, and much longer before Kallan had walked their halls with her mother. Kallan curled her fingers, dragging the tips along the cold, rough stone. Every breath expanded her lungs against her chest wall. Pushing on every broken rib, she counted 3, and knew there were more. She tried to think, and wished her mind alert, but her thoughts didn't obey. They stirred, curiously glanced about, and dozed back to sleep, where they stayed, heavily weighted with a dense cloud that dampened all emotion. She tried to breathe through her nose, but it was swollen, smashed closed, and clogged with dried blood. The sudden sharp intake of breath through her mouth was a mistake. An unrecognizable bitter tang bit her throat, and Kallan gasped, then coughed. Thousands of minute explosions burst like pops of flame through every joint. The constant hum of agony awoke like a dragon, thrashing and roaring throughout her body, ripping and renting the fibers of her being. Stone sliced her back with every movement, adding a layer of fire that managed to split through the carefree cloud that dulled her senses, weakening the haze enough to arouse emotion, but only for brief moments at a time. The spasm subsided, and with it, the dragon, leaving her in a numb state of consciousness. The throbbing was slow to subside, and she tried to move. Bitter copper coated her mouth, and Kallan licked the split in her fattened lip. She moved her hand to assess the damage, but a dead weight pulled on her wrists. A sharp, cold staccato scraped the ground, and a grotesque sick moved in. Panic fought to scream, but the looming cloud persisted. The surge of worry died away to the iron wall in the back of her mind, where fear and care dissipated. Curiously, Kallan felt for the weight and found links of metal. Blindly, she rolled it over and followed the rows of redundant links that climbed to her wrists. There, a set of thick, heavy shackles secured her in place. She continued her investigation down the links of 2 separate chains that joined a single run and ended at the final link burrowed into a cold, jagged stone floor. Kallan opened her eyes, blinked, and closed them again to allow her sight to adjust. Endless and thick, the black enveloped her. Behind her, a single monotonous strip echoed from deep within the cave. She lay there, listening, unconcerned with the drip, the dark, or the chains. A soft orange light shifted in the distance. Uncertain at first as to what it was, Kallan fought her eyes to work. She identified the glimmering black-orange sphere in the distance as a torch or lantern light. In the silhouette of its flame, barely an arm's reach away, Kallan deciphered the outline of a bowl that held the source of a rancid, bitter tang. From the bowl, smoke wafted into the air in a single stream and lofted beautifully around her. Kallan lifted her eyes, more curious than concerned, and studied the shapes that rose from the floor. She dragged her hand to the fumes, mesmerized as they rolled and billowed around her shackled wrists. Through the smoke she made out the crude outline of rock and stone. "Walls," Kallan said. The sound scraped her throat, its melody clawing the raw flesh, and she coughed, sending her into another fit of convulsions that added a new collection of lacerations to her back, shoulders, and legs. When at last her body stilled, she breathed in the air thick with vapor. Her head flopped about on the ground, and she stared stupidly at the bowl. She gazed for a long while and contemplated moving it away, but with every second it became harder to think, and a thick, dense cloud pushed down against her thoughts. Kallan shook her head, which proved to be the worst idea yet. Thoughts jumbled, colliding into one another, until her mind was plunged into disarray, and she lay, panting on the floor, and waiting for the clutter to settle. Her breath slowed, and she tried to think again, but nothing came. A familiar gleam caught her eye, and she reached, taking up one of the links of the chain. Smooth, silver-black metal shimmered in the distant light. Abrupt panic leapt, and her heart jumped, breaking through the daze that suppressed her. All at once she was on her knees, clawing at the floor, panting through nervous huffs of breath, until dizziness pulled her head to the side, and she wavered, falling to the jagged stone that mystically dug at her flesh. "Devagar!" she breathed. Her hand flew to her neck, and Kallan remembered. The back of her throat burned with want to cry. Her precious pendant was lost to the earth. With a desperation that pushed her beyond the haze, Kallan wiped the sting from her eyes. The chain was bulky and heavy in her stiff, swollen fingers. With as much strength as she could muster, Kallan pulled. The metal didn't give. After 2 more feeble attempts that left her drained of energy and dizzy, she remembered the save. Finding the energy within her core was almost impossible. Collecting it through the miasma was harder. Sporadic gusts of sade pulsed through her bonds. The metal shook and whined, protesting the abuse it endured, but remained fastened hard to the floor. Despair increased with every failed attempt, and Kallan blasted the chain again and again. She fought back the fog, but with the bulk of her sade so far out of reach, she could not weaken the forged craft of the Devagar. A final pulse to the metal took the last of her motivation, and exhausted, Kallan dropped her palms to the stone, inviting fresh cuts to her hands. Her head spun with a nausea that swayed back and forth like the sea tosses a ship in a storm. A cold, shallow chuckle crept through her blood, increasing until it became a sadistic laugh. The sound stirred a rage that soon vanished, lacking the coordination to move and the interest to try. Kallan listened to the gritty sound of the laughter. An inner voice beneath the cloud screamed for her to look, to move, to fight, but a greater part of her, most of her, ignored it, despite knowing the voice inside her was right. Stones clicked together, and a fire roared to life, pushing back the shadows. Kallan winced against the sudden stab that gouged her eyes, as a fragrant fog of orange and red wafted into the air. From tangy to sweet, the stench pummeled her mouth. Each flavor took its turn at dominance, never fully mingling into a single odor strong with a flavor. It burned, and she shook her head. Pain seemed to be the only thing that could permeate the cloud. Pain alone seemed to motivate her. A variety of cuts and blood, both dried and fresh, covered her hands. The white chemise she had donned for bed 2 nights ago was shredded and smudged. Streaks of red and black blotted the fabric to match her legs. Kallan gulped in the hopes of easing the nausea, and closed her eyes against the swaying floor. Deep voices rose from the shadows, passing between a sharp staccato and guttural drawl. She knew the sound, but it hurt to remember why. The heavy clod of a boot thundered through the cave and dropped, once, twice, thrice to the floor, then slammed hard into her side. Shards exploded in her torso, accompanying several cracks as she fell against the cave wall and back to the floor, held in place by the chains. Her head rebounded against the stone, imploding a wave through her head that spun like a whirlwind, urging nausea. Fresh cuts sliced her shoulders. She fell, adding to the myriad of pain. "Get up," a small voice from behind her iron wall shouted. "But I don't want to," she said back. The dragon awakened, roared with every breath. Kallan pushed through her chest. Something warm and wet fell onto her face, suffocating her, choking her. She knew she should move, but not caring enough to listen to the voice, Kallan stayed, not bothering to budge from the floor. The guttural growls of foreign syllables barked at her. She attempted to decipher each sound, picking them apart a grunt at a time, and was surprised at how easy it was. But after a few seconds she became disinterested, too heavy with fatigue to try. A tinge of resentment.
Her cold, hard fingers clamped around her neck and pulled her from the ground, freeing her from the stifling heat. It took her to realize the heat was her own hot breath caught beneath a sheet of hair that had fallen onto her face. "The pouch, Drui!" it barked. "Where?" The chain scraped the floor as he jostled her. True to the stories, his eyes were large and black. A pale complexion, much like her own, was buried somewhere beneath a wild black mane of beard and hair. He wore a thick tunic fashioned of heavy brown wool over his large chest. Skeletal was the farthest thing from her mind, as a pair of wide shoulders spanning a hefty frame secured his thick neck. Muscle toned his arms and torso with the kind of brawn a worker would only get from the mines of the forge. He coldly dropped her to the ground, and Kallan winced against the new wave of lacerations before his boot found her gut. Again she gasped, losing the muscle control to regain breath against the second explosion of ribs cracking. "Blaine!" The boot stopped mid-swing. "That's enough!" There was a growl in that command. Through the haze, Kallan lifted her eyes for a chance to look upon her savior. Though as muscular and brawny as the first, he was taller and wider by comparison. He had the same fair skin and round, black eyes, but his left cheek was marked with a scar that spanned his left cheekbone. From the corner of his mouth to the side of his eye, his grotesque appearance churned her nausea. He uttered something in their native tongue, dismissing the one called Blaine and crouching down beside her. "What do you want?" she thought, too weak to speak. "Your pouch," he said with an unkindness that crawled up Kallan's back. "Where is it?" "Where am I?" she tried to ask, but her throat had swollen shut, and it was all she could do to breathe. He crouched closer, bringing his wide nose inches from hers. She could taste the stale earth and putrid sulphur on his clothes. She knew that flavor, that smell, but struggled to remember why. The memory was too old to place. "The only reason why you still breathe," he said, "is because we can't find it. Cooperate. Blaine can only be controlled for a short time, before even I lose status." Kallan shifted a swollen eye to Blaine, who hungrily waited for the go-ahead to continue kicking. "I say again," he repeated, "where is the pouch?" "I don't have it," she tried to say, but her voice failed to obey. She tried something else, something easier. "Take it," Kallan croaked and coughed. Fire shook her body, and a tear slipped from her eye. "Who?" The firelight caught his scar. Kallan thought to answer, but choked on the fear that they would hunt Rune next. The voice in her head screamed in objection, but only a whisper reached her. She could not speak. She could not move, and instead waited for Blaine's judgment. Within that suspended moment, her mind passed in and out of every worry. She thought of Rune and wondered if he had taken Astrid and ridden on without her. He would be in Gunir by now, she pondered, then wondered if he lived. The cloud from the bowl seemed to thicken as it settled down closer, heavier, determined to bury her alive in its bitter tang. It was growing harder to think again. Memory vanished with a voice in her head. Blaine roared, and she stopped caring again. Another explosion erupted in her side. Gasping, Kallan rolled, clutching her torso. Her heartbeat drummed, pushing the blood through her, as if desperately pumping the life back into her. Each beat made her acutely aware of every ache, every bruise, every break. The room spun. Her stomach violently leapt in time to the pulsing of her blood. She convulsed and vomited, closing her eyes against the spasm that returned again and again. A sudden searing chill burned her back, following the length of her spine, and splitting her skin in two. She gasped, holding back a violent scream. Her hand flew to her back, and she sobbed, relieved to feel that her skin had not really split in two. Nerves. She remembered her lessons with Gudrun in the southeastern deserts. Just nerves. The skin hadn't split at all. Kallan touched something hot and wet and recognized her own vomit. Another wave of nausea rose. Shuddering, she fell back to her side, hoping to ease the vertigo. A fire crackled in the distance, filling her with a desire and need to look upon the light in the darkness. She winced and shifted her gaze to the light, fixing her eyes on the lively fire that roared in the center of the cave. Blaine was gone, but the scarred one now stood beside the fire with a third. This one was different.
With a smaller frame, he was slightly shorter and thinner. He looked younger, considerably younger. They spoke in the common tongue. She strained to hear over the incessant pulse as her heart worked to move the blood through every cut and bruise. "Did you find him, Nordri?" "We found the trail several paces off where we think he landed. From there he headed north. We tracked him to the main road of Gunir, but didn't follow further. Any closer, and we'd have the Liasivar warming on us." "And the pouch?" the scarred one asked. Nordri shook his head. "No sign of it anywhere. She may have stashed it somewhere. Durin thinks she left it back in Lorlenalin." "Durin would think that," the scarred one said. His eyes glazed over with the thought as the clod of a boot, heavier than Blaine's, resonated through the cave. Another Duvergar, as wide as Blaine and almost identical in stature, joined Nordri and the scarred one beside the fire. His eyes were significantly smaller, appearing beady, and were set deeper than what seemed natural. Kallan could only assume this was Durin. "Report," came the scarred one's order. Durin took his cue from the commander and answered in common tongue. "The current state has left them vulnerable. An attack now would assure a win." His voice carried as if he wanted Kallan to hear. "Wipe them out, I say! Extinct!" The bowl's cloud muted any protest she would have had, so she lay submissively instead, listening to the discussion. The scarred one silently mulled over the proposition. There was a long silence before anyone spoke again. "Monseigneur?" Nordri pressed. "Monseigneur," Kallan mused. A forgotten name surfaced from the depths of her ancient memory, then fizzled, failing to push through. "Bring her!" The words rang through like a death sentence, and the last of her worry fell numb. Throwing a spiteful look to the broken heap that was Kallan, Monseigneur stepped into obscurity beyond the light. The plod of his heavy boots returned, and just as Blaine came into view, everything went dark.